No man's land in the lost whispers. The Great War had already devoured millions of lives, and yet the thirst for blood remained unquenched. At the heart of Europe stretched no man's land, a miserable and cursed expanse between opposing trenches. The mud, tinged with crimson, hid secrets and horrors that even time dared not erase. The atmosphere was heavy, laden with death, despair, and a primal fear that soaked into every fiber of the soldier's being. The sky, perpetually overcast, seemed to press down upon the men like a slate of lead dot. It was there, in that nameless hell, that the last words were born. Under the flickering light of grimy lanterns and amidst the deafening roar of artillery, ordinary men, torn from their peaceful lives, wrote trembling letters. Each word was a testament of pain, a desperate attempt to keep hope alive, even as they knew their bodies would soon nourish the soaked earth. The letters varied. Some were hopeful, filled with promises of return. Others were confessions, small attempts at redemption before the inevitable. And then there were those that simply overflowed with terror, as if their authors had glimpsed into the abyss itself. Jean-Luc Marchand, a French peasant turned soldier, wrote to his wife, "The ground breathes, Monique. I can feel it. When I walk, it pulls at my steps, yearning to swallow me whole." Days later, Jean-Luc vanished during a night assault. His body was never recovered. His letter, stained with mud and dried blood, was found by a comrade, a haunting testament that refused to be silenced. Reading these words, an unsettling sensation creeps upon us. It is as if these souls, trapped between worlds, still whisper their fears, their sorrows, their final wishes. And somehow, by giving voice to these whispers, we draw them back into existence, if only for a brief, chilling moment, preventing them from slipping away into the cold abyss of eternity. No man's land was more than just a battlefield. It was a ravenous entity. Soldiers feared it more than they feared the enemy. There, the mere act of lifting one's head can invite instant death. Yet sometimes the truest horror came not from the gunfire, but from the absolute silence. Silence so oppressive it made the heart pound like war drums in the ears. It was within that silence that many letters were written. Like that of Otto Baumgartner, a young German soldier who, isolated after a brutal attack, composed his final. "No, if these words are found, know that I died not as a hero, but as a boy who simply wanted to go home." Otto was buried anonymously in a mass grave, but his letter, miraculously preserved, survived the ravages of time to tell his story. These moments, captured on yellowed, blood-stained paper, reveal the naked truth of war. Man reduced to a fragment of fear and hope, struggling to leave one final mark before being consumed by the void of history. But what became of the undelivered letters? Many were lost to the merciless mud, devoured by the earth itself. Others were gathered by comrades in desperate hopes of someday fulfilling them. Some, like forgotten whispers, ended up in the hands of strangers, forever altering the lives of those who read them. In that hell of barbed wire and craters, where the boundary between the real and the unreal blurred with every shot fired, words became the last fragile form of magic left to the men. A frail spell against oblivion, a scream hurled against the indifference of an uncaring universe. It was common for soldiers to carry not just letters to their families, but letters written to themselves, makeshift diaries scribbled on scraps of paper served as fragile levees against madness. Many of these fragments recorded not just feelings, but deeply unsettling events, nocturnal apparitions, disembodied voices, movements in the mist that did not belong to any man. In one such account, unearthed by archaeologists decades later, a British soldier named Harold Pritchard described a night when he was awakened by whispers drifting from no man's land. Peering through the slit of the trench, he saw slender, misshapen figures moving between the craters. They were men, he wrote, but not. They had the form that lacked the soul. They stared at us as if awaiting something we had forgotten. Such descriptions, dismissed as delusions spawned by extreme stress, hide a deeper terror, the notion that the land itself had absorbed the essence of the fallen, reshaping itself into new entities, creatures woven from pain, fear, and abandonment. No man's land had thus become a sacred and profane ground, where life and death mingled in an endless cycle of suffering. With each new offensive, more blood was offered, more souls joined the silent chorus whispering among the ruins. And we, by reading these letters, become participants in this ritual of memory. By giving heed to the final words of these men, we affirm their existence, pulling them back from absolute oblivion, if only for a few somber minutes. Thus endures no man's land, a graveyard without end, a testament to human resilience and despair, a whispering void where the forgotten still cry out to be remembered. The forgotten voices in the shadows beneath the endless gray canopy of the Western Front. A second silence thrive, not one born of exhaustion or fear, but of erasure. The voices of the forgotten, those who fell into the cracks of history, remained, adrift, murmuring in the shadows, begging to be remembered, scattered among the remnants of bombed villages. Half buried in the flooded trenches lay letters that never reached the warmth of home. Words penned with trembling hands, hearts bursting with emotions that would never find closure. These letters, fragile and stained, were fragments of broken souls. Julien Moreau was one such soul. A young Frenchman barely out of adolescence, Julien spent his final weeks entrenched at Verdun, a name that would become synonymous with unimaginable suffering. In a letter addressed to his mother, he wrote, "When the wind sweeps across the battlefield, it carries voices not ours, but those who have fallen. They call to me, Maman. Sometimes I feel their hands upon my shoulders, urging me to join them." Julian's words were never delivered. Instead, they were found stuffed inside the lining of his uniform, discovered long after the war had ended, during excavations in a trench collapsed by years of rain and neglect. His body was dust, but his voice, fragile and persistent, reached. Out across the abyss of time, many other letters spoke not of battles or glory, but of strange visions. Some soldiers confessed to dreams so vivid they blurred into waking life, dreams of blackened skies where stars wept blood, of endless trenches spiraling downward into the very bowels of the earth, of figures lurking just beyond the firelight, whispering in dead tongues. Private Elias Corbin, an American soldier, chronicled his descent into madness in letters never sent. In one, he described seeing a woman dressed in mourning black wandering no man's land at night, untouched by bullets or shellfire. She sings, he wrote, a lullaby I cannot understand. She beckons with hands like withered branches. And those who follow her never return. Elias vanished 2 nights after that final letter, his bunk found empty, his boots and rifle abandoned. Skeptics attribute these tales to the torments of stressed minds, to the breakdown of reason under constant bombardment. Yet a deeper reading suggests something more unsettling. The war had torn a rift in the very fabric of reality, allowing older, darker forces to seep into the wounds of the world. The forgotten soldiers, those without graves, without markers, seemed to exist in a twilight state, neither living nor dead, clinging to the only remnants of their existence, their words. Today, in abandoned archives and private collections, some of these letters still surface. Each carries an undeniable weight, a chill that lingers after the last word is read. It is as if the very act of reading them breathes life back into their authors, however fleetingly, awakening ancient griefs best left undisturbed. Through their fragmented voices, we glimpse a portrait of the war not painted in medals or victories, but in the shivering hands of young men who faced not just death, but something worse, oblivion. Between logic and madness, as the war dragged on, time itself seemed to fracture. Days bled into nights without distinction. Sanity, once anchored by the rhythms of ordinary life, began to erode under the ceaseless barrage of artillery, the stench of rot, and the ever-present specter of death. It was in this grim crucible that reason faltered, and a darker tapestry was woven, one stitched from the frayed edges of the mind. Letters recovered from the trenches began to tell a new story, one less about strategy and valor, and more about disintegration. The human mind, pushed beyond endurance, birthed terrors that transcended the tangible horrors of war. Thomas Whitaker, a British infantryman, left behind a series of notes never meant to be read. In one, he scribbled in a barely legible hand, "There is something here with us. It slithers when the sun sets, crawling through the mud, whispering promises. It knows my name." Days later, Thomas was found dead in his dugout, his expression frozen in an agony that no living man could describe. The walls were clawed, as if he had tried to escape something unseen. He was not alone in his visions. Reports of inexplicable phenomena spread like a quiet contagion among the soldiers. Men spoke of hearing their deceased comrades calling from the darkness, urging them to desert, to walk willingly into no man's land and vanish. Others described seeing trenches that had never existed before, spiraling paths that led them deeper into an unseen abyss, from which few ever returned. Medical officers called it shell shock, a term that sought to explain the unexplainable with clinical detachment. But the soldiers themselves knew better. They had felt that the war was more than guns and gas. It was a tear in the world, a wound from which nightmares leaked into the waking realm. One chilling letter from a French officer, Captain Armand Deschamps, recounted a patrol that never came back. "We sent 10 men beyond the wire," he wrote. "We heard their footsteps, their quiet laughter, then silence. When we found the place where they had crossed, there was no sign, no bodies, no struggle, only a series of footprints that ended abruptly, as if they had been plucked from the earth." Deschamps' own fate would mirror the men he wrote about. He too vanished weeks later during a night patrol, leaving behind only a blood-stained map and his haunting letter. The deeper the war dragged the soldiers into madness, the more vivid the letters became. Some wrote in languages they did not know. Others repeated symbols over and over, strange glyphs that defied translation. Entire battalions would wake screaming from collective nightmares, their cries echoing into the hollow sky. It was as if the very soil had become sentient, conspiring to erase them not merely from life, but from memory itself. Even today, scholars and historians who study these letters report a lingering unease. Some claim to hear faint whispers when handling the more damaged ones, a phenomenon dismissed as imagination, yet it persists, gnawing at the corners of the rational mind. Between logic and madness, the soldiers penned their final testaments, not just to their loved ones, but to anyone at all, who might one day remember that they had lived, that they had fought, and that they had suffered in ways no history book could ever fully contain. The promise of return never fulfilled among the countless letters stained by mud and blood. There exists a heartbreaking pattern, a persistent thread woven from promises that would never be kept. Soldiers, clinging to fragile strands of hope, wrote to their families, their lovers, their children, swearing that they would return, that somehow, against the grinding machinery of death, they would survive. Emilio Ricci, a young Italian infantryman, was one such dreamer. In a letter to his little sister, he wrote, "When the flowers bloom again, I will sing to you from the balcony, and we will laugh as we always did." His words, full of a childlike innocence, belie the horrors surrounding him. Found tightly clutched in his lifeless hand, the letter was the only remnant of a life cut short in a meaningless skirmish over a few meters of barren ground, Promises like Emilio's littered the trenches. Entire bags of undelivered letters were found after battles, each one a time capsule of yearning and denial. Some soldiers described the gifts they had prepared for their loved ones. Others spoke of future weddings, imagined homes, unborn children. Fantasies spun in the face of death, fragile illusions battling against the encroaching darkness. The emotional dissonance was profound. These men witnessed daily mutilation, heard the final gasps of their comrades, and saw the earth itself churned into a grotesque parody of life. Yet in their letters, they wrote of springtime, of reunions, of dances and feasts, as if the act of writing could conjure a reality that no longer existed. One letter, penned by Private Samuel Green of the Royal Fusiliers, captured this desperate duality. "I can almost hear the church bells, darling Anna," he wrote. "When I close my eyes, I see the river, the green fields. I see you waiting for me. Tell me you are waiting. Tell me you believe I will come back." Samuel's body was never recovered. His letter, however, made its way to Enna, arriving like a ghost at her doorstep. She kept it until her own death, reading it every year on the anniversary of the day he left. Historians often marvel at the resilience of the human spirit, how men at the brink of annihilation clung to dreams. But there is something deeper, more haunting, an unconscious acknowledgement that the promises were not meant to be fulfilled, that the letters themselves were a form of ritual, a final binding to the world they knew they would soon depart. Many families receiving these letters spoke of strange occurrences, dreams where the departed stood at the threshold but never entered, whispers heard on quiet nights. Some claimed their loved ones had visited them one last time, pressing unseen kisses to their foreheads, murmuring farewells carried by the evening. Breeze thought the promises made in those trenches were not lies. They were acts of desperate defiance against oblivion. To promise return was to spit in the face of the devouring dark, to assert that love, memory, and identity could endure even when flesh and bone could not. Today, these letters remain as brittle relics, housed in museums and archives, or treasured in private collections. They speak not only of the war's brutality, but of a deeper tragedy, the universal human yearning to be remembered, to matter even as the forces of history conspire to erase. And in the faded ink and trembling script, if you listen closely, you can still hear them, the echoes of voices promising to come home, forever reaching across a chasm they could never cross. The legacy of the Condemno Grand Monument. No eloquent speech could capture the raw ache contained within these forgotten mutters. They exist apart from history books and ceremonies, raw and unfiltered, stripped of glory and national pride. In their trembling words, we find no tales of conquest, only young men grappling with fear, clinging to the frayed edges of memory and identity as the abyss opened before them. Their legacy is not etched in marble or engraved on metals. It is scrawled hastily on scraps of paper, carried across battlefields by trembling hands, surviving miraculously in mud-caked pockets. Each letter is a monument far more enduring than any obelisk, a shard of humanity, defiantly resisting erasure. Some of these artifacts have found their way into museums, displayed behind glass, inert and lifeless to the casual observer. But for those who linger, who dare to read beyond the faded ink, an invisible current can be felt. A low, persistent murmur of lives interrupted, of laughter stifled, of futures that evaporated before they could begin. One such collection unearthed near the some decades after the guns fell silent included letters still sealed, their paper fused together by blood and rain. Among them was the final message of Corporal Hugo Meyer, a German schoolteacher conscripted into a conflict he did not understand. "Forgive me," he wrote to no one in particular, "for I have forgotten how the world once smelled of bread in summer." And hope. The war consumed not just the bodies of men, but their dreams, their innocence, their humanity. The letters reveal the slow corrosion of the soul, the way terror seeps into the marrow, eroding the distinction between man and ghost, but they also reveal something stubborn, something radiant, the refusal to be forgotten dot in the decades that followed the war as survivors grew old and the world marched into new atrocities. These letters resurfaced like long-buried seeds sprouting in broken ground. They were read at memorials, tucked into anthologies, whispered in documentaries. And every time a voice was raised to speak their words aloud, it was as if the dead stirred briefly in their endless sleep, warmed by the simple act of remembrance. Yet, there's a chilling understanding that clings to these stories, an awareness that memory itself is fragile, that history forgets far more than it remembers, that someday, perhaps sooner than we would like to admit, even the letters may turn to dust, and the final echoes of these young men will fade beyond recall. Their legacy is not victory, nor even survival. It is the ache they left behind, the silent testimony that to be human is to love, to dream, and to mourn, even in the face of annihilation. And so long as one heart remembers, so long as one voice dares to whisper their names into the dark, they endure, silent, waiting, listening. A final reflection amid the ashes of time, the letters are not simply echoes of war. They are warnings, reflections cast from a time when humanity slipped dangerously close to the edge of annihilation. Through them, we're forced to confront the fragility of civilization, the paper-thin barrier that separates order from chaos, compassion from cruelty. There are no true heroes in these final words, only men. Men who feared, who loved, who cried out for mothers and sweethearts and salvation. Their suffering was not glorious. It was raw, degrading, and absolute. And yet, within the tattered remains of their testimonies, there is a stubborn glimmer of something indomitable, an aching defiance that refused to let them be erased. As we read their words, we must ask ourselves, what lessons have we learned? Have we honored their memory, or merely built new machines of war, ever more efficient, ever more detached from the human cost? Their letters are not merely artifacts. They are mirrors held up to our own faces, demanding that we see and remember and breathe. Each letter is a whispered secret carried across the decades, a desperate plea. Do not forget us. Do not let our pain vanish into statistics and footnotes. In every syllable, there is a pulse, a final heartbeat echoing across the void, reaching for someone, anyone, who will listen. Perhaps the true tragedy is not that so many died, but that so many were forgotten, buried under layers of history, their names eroded by time, their hopes swallowed by indifference. Yet, if even one letter remains, if even one voice can still be heard, then they are not entirely lost. We owe them more than silence. We owe them our memory, our sorrow, our vigilance, because the ghosts of no man's land still linger, crouched between the folds of forgotten fields and empty skies. They are not at peace. They murmur in the ruins, in the darkened woods, and the wind that sweeps across desolate battlefields. They are waiting, watching Dot, and perhaps they always will be, until we too remember what it means to stand against the void.
Thank you for watching this video. We kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, activate the notification bell to be informed about our posts. See you in the next video.